There are some games that I played as a kid that I never really ended up getting into much or finishing that I've been meaning to revisit throughout my life, like Breath of Fire 3. I first played that game when I was really little. It seems absolutely phenomenal, so I really should get back to that at some point. Advance Wars is another one, though I'm not super keen on revisiting it. I kind of dislike war games in general, to be frank. However, one of the games I've thought about revisiting the most is Golden Sun, a game series I see people rave about a lot online and thought I might have not given a fair shake when I played it as a kid. Back then I just found it kind of boring, so I decided to replay it and give it my thoughts. Here they are. The premise of the original Golden Sun is pretty simple. Isaac and his best friend Garrett attempt to stop two people who are trying to reactivate alchemy globally by lighting four MacGuffin centers known as lighthouses. These lighthouses would unseal the power of alchemy that was put away thousands of years prior to the game in order to stop people from fighting over it. The opening hours of the game do a really good job of getting you invested in all of this. The game begins with a prologue 3 years before the events of the story. And it's through this prologue we see Isaac lose his father, and his good friend Jenna lose her entire family. In the present, we find out that Jenna's brother actually survived, but is now working with those who would see alchemy return. Her brother kidnaps her and Isaac's mentor, and you have to stop him from relighting all the lighthouses. But once you set out on this quest, things lose steam extremely quickly. The best comparison I can think to make here is something like The Wheel of Time, or at least the first few books. I gave up after a bit. It's very much a quest, where the only narrative progression is based around how close the characters are to the actual physical goals they're trying to attain, which I simply don't find very compelling as a narrative framework. Even still, a lot of the most interesting parts of the game, like Felix's backstory, are simply not elucidated throughout most of the game. Instead, the game chooses to focus on little pocket side narratives. This can work pretty well, and does for many RPGs. Dragon Quest is arguably the master of this, like many things in the RPG space. However, the micro-narratives of Golden Sun are simply not interesting to me. Why should I care if a town of people turned themselves into trees because they were being assholes? Why should I care about a city full of thieves that looks like the same as every other town? You just go from place to place and solve people's problems with very few unique characters to speak of, barreling through generic fantasy trope towns. It's a real shame. The opening here has so much promise, but the execution ends up feeling like wandering aimlessly through a map. Maybe coming closer to a lighthouse? It's hard to tell where they even are due to how the world map presents itself. The world in the game itself is vibrant and colorful, but to the point that it kind of hurts my eyes. I'm uniquely pretty sensitive to saturation in video games. It's something that people like to joke about a lot with me. I had to turn down the brightness significantly for the game for it to not cause, like, actual pain in my retinas though, and that's not a joke. That aside, I think that the graphics are pretty inspired, even if they aren't really my thing. You don't see many pre-rendered sprite-based RPGs that often. It's essentially this and Super Mario RPG that I can think of off the top of my head, so it gives it a distinct look. With that being said, way too many of the game's areas and NPCs are totally reused, which is understandable due to it being a handheld title with a small budget, but it still ends up making everything feel the same. It's easier for me to forgive the amount of reused music tracks in the game though, not because they are particularly different or anything, but because I just kind of think this game has an awesome soundtrack. I'm not someone who's particularly versed in music theory, so my discussion of the soundtrack kind of boils down to just that. I think the game's soundtrack fucks really hard, in particular the game's battle theme. However, what you're actually doing during the battles is never all that interesting. Look, I love JRPGs. I am an ardent defender of them a lot of the time. However, I don't find Golden Sun's combat system to be engaging in the slightest compared to other JRPGs. You don't have very many options at all to go with during combat, so a lot of combat just ends up being the two parties hitting each other until one wins. There is magic, sure, but it's almost always better to use physical attacks because they don't cost any resources and they deal roughly the same amount of damage most of the time. With that being said, there's one aspect of the game's combat that felt a little more interesting: the Djinn system. Throughout the game you collect little spirits called Djinn, think like a genie, which you can equip on your party members to change their stats and even some of their abilities. During battle, there's a choice you can make with them. You can summon them and lose the buffs for a brief period, or you can just leave them equipped. This choice is the most interesting part of the battle system, though most battles end too quickly for this to really be a choice you have to run into, which is kind of a common problem in RPGs. Why bother with this system when the game doesn't call for it very often? With that being said, I really appreciate the effort, and I think there is room to iterate on it in interesting ways. While I find the magic in battles to be pretty standard elemental fare, on the overworld it's a bit of a different story. Though it's nothing incredibly revolutionary or anything, the way that your spells can interact with the map around you is interesting. You can use a giant hand to move things, of course, like the Super Smash Bros. Thing, but you can also use the elemental spells to your advantage to change the environment. Frost spells make giant pillars of ice out of puddles for you to traverse across, for instance. It's a system that ends up giving a lot more diegetic meaning to the moves you use in battle, and it makes it easier to build a connection with them because of that. My favorite is the mind-reading one. There are a lot of good jokes in each NPC's unique mind-read dialogue, and sometimes interesting context, but mainly just humor, which I do think was a bit of wasted potential. Golden Sun ends in a very strange way. Only 2 of the MacGuffins are dealt with, and the people who are kidnapped at the beginning aren't even saved. It just sort of ends with Isaac and his ragtag group of heroes setting sail. That's because The Lost Age, the next game in the series, was originally supposed to be part of the same game as the original Golden Sun. It's a Sonic 3 and Knuckles situation where the 2 games were split up. The Lost Age is a unique continuation. Instead of following Isaac and his pals as they go around doing basically nothing, you instead follow Jenna's brother Felix in his adventures with the people he kidnapped to light the remaining 2 lighthouses. The plot here begins to get a bit more interesting. It's through this quest that Felix learns that restoring alchemy to the world is actually in the best interest of everyone. It's what keeps the world in balance, and the fact that they sealed it away was causing issues all over. I frankly find this twist to be super compelling. It completely makes up for the fact that the first half of this one is sort of spinning its wheels as Felix runs around doing fetch quests. The idea that the villains from the first half were actually saving the world from further ecological disaster is a concept that I find very fascinating and almost recontextualizes my experiences with the first game into something more compelling. With that being said, Golden Sun is still largely a long-winded fantasy novel. It has some really cool ideas in it, but you have to wade through a lot of the other stuff first. As a side note, there is one other cool aspect of The Lost Age, though. The fact that you can transfer over your save data from the original Golden Sun so your party stays the same. It's nothing huge, but I always like when games do that. While I initially thought going into the original Golden Sun I would really dislike it, I've come out of it with a new appreciation. Sure, I still think that largely these 2 games are full of a lot of fantasy filler fluff, but at the end of the day, there's something special you can find here. Maybe just condense it a bit next time, Camelot. Perhaps I'll check out Dark Dawn as well at some point. This has been Arcade Everlasting, hater of bright colors, signing off. Thank you for watching.